This is WPSL Port St. Lucie, the talk of the Treasure Coast.
It's 10:08 at WPSL 1590, the talk of the Treasure Coast. And this is 122923. Ask a Rabbi.
Okay, there you go. 1229-2023. Got it.
Got it.
So, yep. Now that, of course, is the secular Gregorian calendar.
I know. That's why I didn't say Happy New Year to you, because you've already celebrated.
Well, that's true. We celebrated. We're in 5784, and now the Gregorian calendar at least joins us for the last digit, starting Monday.
There you go.
Yeah, it's kind of interesting. I was walking. I walk my hounds, all two of them, some days, as many days as I can, and often at night. And it was interesting to was talking with somebody who's actually watching right now, that one of the benefits of walking the dogs at night is that I get to see the moon in its phases.
Oh, yeah.
Right. And so it was right around the middle of the lunar month. And that's part of why the lunar calendar was used with ancient groups. But I digress. I need to actually back up and say, this is Rabbi Shafir Loeb of Congregation Eitz Chayim.
I was going to ask
Jewish
who you
home
were.
on the Treasure Coast. Yeah, who the heck am I? Sometimes we just launch into talking. But anyway, back to the moon. So that's one of the reasons why a lunar calendar was used before we had a solar calendar or a concept of time. Certainly when people were mostly shepherds and or hunter-gatherers, they would have used the moon because it was an easy way to tell what was going on, what time of, they could count how many moons there were. You can count 12 of those or 13 of those quite easily. And so if you read in Talmud about the calendar, it talks about the lunar cycle, but it also talks about recognizing what crops are coming out of the ground at a given time. And so that's how it's intercalated. In fact, one of the ways where we know we're coming up on a secular leap year, there's going to be a February 29th in 2024. And that formula is complicated because that's if it's divisible by 4, but not by 100. But if it is by 400, and that's because the reality is that days are not 24 hours.
No.
There are 23 hours and some number of minutes most days. And we wobble a little bit, so the days are not even precise that way. But there's a leap year system because even the solar calendar doesn't match up perfectly with the system. And that imperfection is absolutely perfectly the way it's supposed to be. And it just is. It's not good, bad, or different. It just is. And the lunar calendar, 12 months, doesn't work either, because we're 365 and a quarter, almost kind of sort of days in a year. And that quarter kind of sort of makes a problem. Plus the extra 5 days takes off of the 360, and they add up over time. And that's why there's a divergence between the calendars. But Talmud says that it's a leap year if you come through this month and the barley has not yet sprouted, you add an extra month to wait for the barley to sprout in spring.
Wow.
And,
really?
Right. And so we added
all
extra.
the way back then.
All the way back then. They had to add an extra month to keep the months in sync with the seasons, because the lunar schedule is different from the solar schedule. And it just is.
That's funny. Yeah.
Yeah. And God didn't start a calendar. God didn't say on the first of this or this. Well, yes, there's some of those. It's like on the first day of the 7th month shall be a day of celebration for you. Okay, that makes sense.
Did God create the IRS? I'm sorry. That's April 15th.
Yes, and well, that brings another point, right? April
Oh,
Fools.
no, come on.
You segued for me. Thank you. That. But there was a time when the New Year started in April, which kind of makes sense because you're coming out of winter and it's spring. And for a while, that was the beginning of the year. And
Weren't there like Christmas celebrations later than?
well, okay, so according to Christian scriptures, Jesus is born when the shepherds are out in the fields with their sheep,
Mm-hmm.
right? That's even in some of the Christmas songs.
Oh, yeah, sure.
Right. So, you don't even have to read the Bible to know that one, but it is in Christian scripture. They don't believe me. Having been in Bethlehem in December, you don't lay out with the sheep if you don't have to. Not this time of year, you freeze your little tush off. But it's bloomin' cold in Bethlehem in winter.
Like how cold is cold?
Like snow cold.
Snow cold. Okay.
Yeah.
Welcome to Green Bay.
Yeah. When my roommate and I went out to Bethlehem, we got a Christmas pass for Bethlehem because Americans can get that. At least in those ancient days, you could do that. And they were selling all kinds of wonderful little trivia if you wanted it. But I think we wore 2 pairs of pants and 2 or 3 tops.
Whoa.
I mean, it was
cold.
It was cold, and we knew we were going to be outside. So yeah, it's up in the hills. It's not a low desert kind of place.
And you were living in the Midwest at that point, right?
No, at that point, I was living in Pennsylvania, but
still, you're from cold country.
Yeah.
No, okay.
Yeah,
it was still cold.
It was still cold. It was.
Oh.
I don't do well when water freezes. And there were a ton of the biggest entertainment aside from watching the processions, which was kind of interesting, a little bit of pageantry, but there were a lot of American choirs that had made a Christmas trip to the Holy Land kind of thing. So
sure.
We sat and listened to a lot of American Christmas songs.
Okay.
And bought some stamps and things like that. But it was very cold. It was very, very cold. And of course, there are multiple churches of the same thing. So there's, Jesus was born in 5 different places because nobody's really sure where that was. And that's one of the more interesting pieces because we really don't know a lot of these things that people think they know.
Should fire those editors of the Bible. What's going on?
It doesn't have to do with editing the Bible. The Bible doesn't say where. And yeah, what can I say?
Yeah, Carol went there, and she just was fascinated with the various religions and
yeah, everybody's got their own little place.
Yeah.
That's all the same thing, but it's different, separate. It's kind of it's interesting to watch it, and you see the different processions of different groups of priests. It was interesting, but the bottom line is you don't lay out with the sheep in December because they're just huddling together and trying to stay warm. But where you do lay with the sheep in the fields is when they're lambing, which is in spring.
Wow.
Right. So, and there's actually another really good reason to say that Jesus was probably born in spring, which is when he goes to the temple and answers questions at around age 12. What that's telling us is that he was ahead of his age because most boys have their bar mitzvah celebration at 13, but it can be anywhere from 12 years and a day up. And so what they're telling us is that Jesus goes around his birthday and is examined at the temple and has his bar mitzvah celebration. That's a bar mitzvah description. There are lots of life cycle descriptions in Christian scriptures, but you kind of have to know what they are and what's going on to catch that.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
And that's one of the reasons why I've offered in the past, and trying to figure out how to put together a course in that right now. But the Jewish understanding of Christian scriptures, how to unpack some of those stories that are in Christian scripture, because they're interesting. You get an interesting depiction of his life, but that would have been in spring. And taxes, even then, were collected in spring because nobody would be willing to pay in the winter. And you have to remember that Joseph and Mary are going to Bethlehem to pay the tax, to get censused.
Oh, well,
Right. The
okay.
census and the tax were simultaneous, and those were in spring. Right. The census was taken because everybody threw in their shekel or the dinar or whatever, depending on where Rome was in the level of occupation at the time. But you threw the money in, and then they counted the money. They didn't count the people. They counted the money.
Okay.
But everybody gave a fixed amount, and then there was other taxes that were according to your stuff. But nobody would have been willing to pay that during the winter when you're not sure you're going to have enough money to get through and buy food. You're going to get a
That's
lot
fascinating.
more. You're going to get a lot
Yeah.
more resistance than you will when people are feeling good about the crops sprouting and they see their work is going to give them a yield. Much more willing to spend money. Just makes sense. So that's when you're going to collect a tax, because you want to collect it when people are reasonably happy. We just read in Torah on the Jewish cycle about how Joseph collected a tax, a 20% tax on the Egyptians, which they didn't mind paying during the years of plenty because they had so much. But then when the famine hit, they were hard pressed to pay that tax. And that,
I would imagine.
yeah. And so they sell first their property, first their animals and their land, and then themselves actually to Pharaoh in order to pay that tax. And then they become servants living on the land and having to do that. So,
Wow.
yeah.
Okay. Well, that makes sense because, I remember this one crazy priest that we had in the theology class who was saying, yeah, he said the easiest thing to remember is when we celebrate Easter, it's really Christmas. And so, we're sitting there going, huh? What's he talking about? This makes perfect sense, though.
It does.
Because it was an agricultural society.
Right. Absolutely. Even though there were a number of people who had already moved into cities, we see Jerusalem and Caesarea is made by Herod the builder for the Romans to keep them out of Jerusalem and also give them a seaport. And you can go and see the ruins of Caesarea even today. They're there with an amphitheater and all the typical Roman stuff. Yeah.
Oh, wow.
It's actually a wonderful visit.
Huh.
Yeah. That's where my dog had to go to the third story of a building when I still had a fear of heights. Thank you. My dog did not.
Oh, no.
Oh, yeah. And I got to follow her all the way up to the third floor, crawling up the stairs by the time we got to the top. And she happily went to every window and looked out. She was quite the sightseer.
Oh, sure.
She was very happy. Her mother, not so much. What can I say? But in any event, so it makes sense that Jesus is born in spring. It's also highly likely that the crucifixion would have been in fall, because that was a time when Rome did many of them. People didn't really travel until spring, so that might have been a time of travel around Easter. More likely again, though, Sukkot. And why do I say that? Because Sukkot is the festival where people walk around Jerusalem with palm leaves.
Oh.
And if we're going to take Christian scripture at its, if we're going to take that at its word, then that happens.
Wow.
Yeah, that happens in fall. And it's a time when Rome is very nervous, because that's when rebellions tend to happen. Why do rebellions tend to happen? Because there's as much nationalism as any time of the year occurs in that holiday, because it's a celebration of harvest. It's the fall harvest, and it's a good time. There's drink. They spend, this is another wonderful part about Sukkot, they spend all night drawing water from Solomon's pools, and then they spend all day pouring it with the wine in the morning.
No.
And as we've mentioned other times, the wine in those days does not look like even Manischewitz coming out of a bottle. It looks much more like mead. They would have squashed the grapes and kept the meat from the grapes in the fermenting process, and it would have been much more like a mead, a thick concentrate, and you would have put water in it to drink it. You would have cut it. And so that's what the
It's
water,
almost like canned soup or something.
yeah, very much so. And you would put water in it. There's a beautiful description of a water pouring celebration in Talmud that they did during Sukkot, where they would pour they had different pitchers for water and for wine and bowls that would collect it. And obviously the bowls would then be, fill your cup kind of thing. Because if you keep pouring it in, then it's got to go somewhere. Where does it go? It goes into people's cups. And so it's a drinking, and they roast 70 oxen every day. It's a big party, folks. And yes, to the vegans, it smells like dead animals roasting. It did then too, but that's what it would have been. It would have been food and drink in great abundance. And the priests at the temple are just mass producing this. There's an interesting story also in Talmud about a priest who spills some of the wine or the water, whichever, we're not quite sure which, but when he spills it on his feet, the people pelt him with the etrog, which is a ornamental Chinese citrus that made its way into Israel for the celebration of Sukkot. So there's a Silk Road even back when. I'm not sure when the etrog became.
Wow, that's fascinating.
Yeah.
Because there you always go back to that Silk Road.
Yeah, the Silk Road is clearly happening. And yeah, just an interesting thing. There's clear connections. There's clear connections in the sacred story of different traditions as it comes down. And these are the stories that people would know and remember. But yeah. So that water pouring is really important. You have to pour water into the wine to make it drinkable, which of course brings up the Cana story. Likely a wedding, probably Jesus, because it's the groom's job to put the water into the wine to make it drinkable for people. Why the groom? There's a reason for that too. He's feeling good about getting married, so he's going to be generous. He's not going to overcut the wine so that it's not weak.
Wow.
Right?
Okay.
But he's also going to know how many guests he has, and he's going to have an idea of what he has to do. And why does his mother come and get him? Because she's reminding him, it's your job, get up from your buddies long enough to go make the wine. It's not that it miraculously turns the water into wine. Only somebody who drinks a later version of wine after wine is distilled and filtered is going to have that concept. But that was not the way ancient wine was made.
Wow.
Well, we know that from stuff that's left over in containers from that period, from archaeology. Thank you. Things change over time. Nobody would have thought of a frozen anything until you have freezers.
Right. Exactly. Sure.
Yeah. One of the biggest things in Tucson was bringing ice into the community for the ice houses. And the job there was just to keep it from melting long enough to be able to sell it to people, to put in their ice boxes so that they could keep things like butter and the few perishable things.
Mm-hmm.
But in those days, meat sat out. That's why you couldn't use it for very long, because it would spoil. Couldn't freeze it. Couldn't keep it all week. Couldn't buy chicken on Friday and have it on Tuesday.
Mm-hmm.
You would need to eat it over the weekend. So yeah, it's a different world, and to recognize that is so important. And the closest thing that I can recommend to people locally is to go to one of these locations where they do interpretations. My favorite one personally is Old Williamsburg, Colonial Williamsburg. It's the company makes a ton of money, but what they do is a tremendous service, which is they, excuse me, they call it interpreting, where they have characters in period costume talking in the English that would have been spoken
Oh,
in
okay.
1774, 75. So it's set right before the revolution. The people you're talking to are being British citizens, but there's the talk of rebellion and resistance going on. So it's this tension built time.
Mhm.
And they tell you what was going on and they show you. And for me personally, that was an aha, because until I went there, I really didn't understand the difference between having electricity and not having it. We wouldn't have this miracle called radio. We wouldn't be able to, Mr. Mevo certainly didn't exist. And, you and I remember a time when nothing that small could have done anything like this.
Sure.
And where the cameras were as big as I am.
Oh, much bigger. Much, believe me.
Yeah, the original
The
cameras.
ones that we had in Tucson were from the Seattle World's Fair.
Wow.
In whenever it was, I'm not sure whether it was 66 or whatever.
A while back.
They were huge.
Yeah.
They were huge.
Well, the first cameras had to be mounted and moved.
Oh, yeah. Yeah.
And if you look at the really old stuff, it's very different from what we can do now. I enjoy watching NCIS, and I get a kick out of it because they have that circular thing they do, a nice art shot of the characters where they go round and round and round. And I confess, I'm wondering if they're not on a turntable with a fixed camera and just a backdrop.
Actually, it is a portable camera that is on
a swivel thing overhead.
Well, or they can use the regular camera shoulder mounted with what do they call it? The Steadicam.
Okay,
is what they called it,
because it goes
and
round and round.
Yeah, you can do all sorts of things with it.
Yeah. And I enjoy that. And Sharon is saying the Seattle World's Fair was early 60s because she went there.
Oh, okay. Well, there you go.
Feedback from Sharon. Thank you for that.
Thank
Sharon.
you. Yeah.
And yeah, so there are people around who remember these things, which is important because today's youth, my college students, do not. But then today's college students don't remember 9/11.
No.
They don't know what it was like. They don't know what it was like to have a cash-based economy, which America was in the 90s, in the 80s and 90s. We were cash-based before the debit card.
Mm-hmm.
Before the debit card, there was
Sure.
only credit cards, and most people
Checks.
only had 2 or 3, and people wrote checks.
Yeah.
And checks bounced, boing, boing, boing. And yeah, and you didn't know. We sold stuff. We didn't know if a credit card was going to go through because you didn't put it through there was nothing like Square or
Zelle
or any of those things, right? And none of those things that work now were not around in the day. We had that paper thing that you laid the piece of paper down.
Oh, yeah.
Chunk, chunk.
Yep.
You had to make sure you got a good imprint. You got the person to sign it. You turned in that paper to the bank, and that's how you made the deposit. They processed it. I say that to kids today, and they look at me like I have got a second head sitting out here.
Oh, yeah. They wouldn't understand that at all.
They think that I'm from some other planet. And but it's just our own history. And so when time changes, when time moves on like that, we forget what was the norm. I had a friend in Tucson. She has since passed, but she used to like to the Jewish History Museum is located in Tucson, and one of the things that she used to do at board meetings to help us keep this sense of why it's important to recognize history, why it's important to keep a record of things, she would bring out devices like butter molds and things like that people used in the day and let us guess what the tool was for.
Okay. What's a butter mold?
it's what you scoop from the butter, and you didn't, it wasn't nice to put out a tub of it. You put out these little butter molds on
Oh, okay.
pieces,
Okay.
for fancy dinners
Yeah.
and things like that. So when you see those little butter things at a restaurant, that's what that's kind of reminiscent of.
Okay. Huh.
Not the ones that they wrap up in the little
Squares.
yeah, but the cute little ones, the flowers and those things when you go to
Okay.
to a fancy place.
Okay. Huh.
That was considered the norm because of how butter was maintained and that it was moldable when it was fresh.
Uh-huh. Interesting.
So, yeah. And of course, today's kids, I love to show them the video of how to use a dial phone
Oh,
because they have no idea why we even say dial your phone.
when we had the Kiwanis kids helping us with the Christmas kids, it was so funny. They're from Fort Pierce Central, and there were 9 of them. And the woman who was helping us with the whole center, she took them and I don't know where this old thing came from, but it was the old Fort Pierce operator.
Mm-hmm.
And it had the whole thing and this round dial, this weird round dial.
They didn't know what to do with it.
And she said, dial your phone.
Mm.
With what?
Yeah.
The dial.
Mm.
And she said the kids looked at her like she had 5 heads.
Yeah.
She said, what's your phone number? And so then, then she would do it. And they looked at her and said, wow, that's amazing.
Yeah.
And then she said, then you would plug this in to talk to this person. If you want to call Miami, you plug that in and those two can talk.
Yeah.
And she, it was so funny because most of the kids were like 14, 15.
Yeah, they have no idea.
And no concept.
They had no concept that things had to be hardwired to work.
Yeah.
There were no satellites.
Oh, no.
Sharon said she had a phone where you had to crank to get the operator.
Whoa. Now that is, I think, before my time. Maybe
and then
not.
a party line.
Oh, wow.
Yeah. You and Sharon are not that far apart.
No. But wait a minute. We did have a party line in Tucson, as I remember, back in the early 70s. Huh. Okay.
Party lines are not that old. If you have an older parent or grandparent, especially if you didn't live in the cities, because the big phone systems came into the cities first. But the more you lived, the further out from town you lived, the more likely you were to have a party line or operator assisted. I joke about the old ways we used to deal with the operator because it wasn't that long ago when we paid horrendous fees for long distance phone calls.
Oh, yeah. You bet.
And I mean, we paid, I think, a call when I lived in Israel, it was like $1 or $2 a minute to talk to the US.
Oh, I'm not surprised at all.
No.
Yeah.
And that, of course, was a lot more money back then because minimum wage was $1.60, folks. Yeah, I'm dating myself. But and today we just pick up. I call my niece. It blows my mind. She does WhatsApp and Facebook and all those video things. The first time that when I talked to her a couple of years ago, she's doing FaceTime on a bus. That was
Oh, sure. Yeah. That's.
And I was thinking about that. Sharon just said, I worked for the phone company for 17 years.
Oh, wow.
So she actually remembers that 1 ringy dingy, 2 ringy dingies.
And if folks have not ever seen this bit on Laugh-In with Lily Tomlin,
it's a classic.
You've got to go to YouTube and see it because you'll cry.
Yeah.
You will laugh so hard you will cry. And she was awesome.
She was amazing.
She was just so funny. But yeah, I mean, most of us had not seen that, but my mom remembers it quite well.
Yeah.
And it was funny because they had she was talking about when she and my aunt, I guess, were extras at Warner Brothers. And then, of course, they had one of those operators
Mm-hmm.
at the main Warner Brothers studios as well. And she talked about that. And I'd never seen one.
Yeah. Yeah. It's there's a woman in our congregation. Well, Sharon is a member of our congregation, but there's another woman there who ran the switchboard on occasion at the law firm where she worked when when she first got out of high school.
And of course, the big invention was Princess phones,
Oh yeah.
touch phones. Really? You could do that?
Yeah.
Oh,
Well, I remember trying to beat the contest of the dial phone versus the push button that they had at the New York World's Fair.
oh, okay.
I was very young, but I remember that because that's when push buttons were first coming. They hadn't yet come out. And everybody said, what the heck is the star and the pound sign for? And the phone company said, we'll have a use for those down the road when enough of them are out. But we're going to start putting them out now because you don't have those on the dial phone. So there's things you can't do on a dial phone that you can do on a push button phone because it has those extra 2 buttons. And don't we use that now, right? Hit the number and then hit pound at the end of it so that you know that you're done entering a password or a PIN or something like that.
What fascinates me is who are the visionaries at like AT&T and companies like that?
Oh, I've got a better question for you. What are they thinking of now?
Oh, well, yeah.
Right.
Yeah.
Right. So that's the whole idea behind some of these fairs, these science fairs that companies go to. It's the concept cars. Those are testing out ideas for the future, some of which will work and some won't.
That's what they're for.
Yeah. Yeah. My husband actually came across one of his old iPhones or old cell phones, and it was this tiny little thing. Everybody's got these big ones now that are little.
Did he have a little flip phone?
He did have a little flip phone for a long time. It took forever to get him to get rid of that. It was using my smartphone. I was the first one to get the smartphone, and then I propagated it to others. And I started it because a friend of mine had one, and she was showing me all the things she could do. And my brother-in-law was visiting, and he kept asking the phone questions and getting an answer, which just fascinated me. And the more he did that, the more I went and got. And I actually started out with 2 phones. One was an iPhone and the other one was an Android. And I ended up staying with the iPhone. Like now all my phones are iPhones, and my tablet is also Apple. But my computer at home is PC. I did have an Apple back when they came out, the Apple II and the Apple IIe. And when Big Blue came out with the PC, we went over to that technology. So I remember those things. I remember looking at the little computer, the little Apple IIe, and knowing that it had more active RAM than the IBM 360 I had learned when I was in high school that was at the University of Pennsylvania in Philadelphia. So technology moves, but it's sometimes hard for somebody who doesn't have an idea of that. The IBM 360 had an entire room, had a whole building basically dedicated to it. It lived on a raised floor with air conditioning circulating underneath it. And it would, when it was dying, when it would go belly up, which was frequently, then it would ring a bell, and the little ants, those of us around it, would run around and physically turn off the drives, because if you let the needle land by itself, it would damage the data that was on the drive. So you had to run in and ease that arm, take it off the drive and put it off to the side and let it come down. And you did that both to save the arm and to save the data that was on the disk.
Well, you talk about technology. We were watching, I guess, a bowl game the other night, and it was the Ball Bowl, and she was talking about these jars that you used to, make various canned goods, if you will,
The ball jars. Yeah.
The ball jars.
Yeah.
Well, and
Now they're plastic.
well, yeah, but this company, they had a commercial during the game. Well, this ball company moved on to technology, and it's their mirrors that are on that satellite
Okay.
that is getting these outrageous pictures of the other galaxies. And you think, wow, you go from making jars
Because it's glass.
to this
Mirrors are glass.
amazing, right, exactly.
Yeah.
But
There's always a
wow,
string that connects them, but yeah.
yeah, it's incredible.
Yeah.
Absolutely incredible.
And if you look at some of those behind the scenes of who's doing what, look at the food connections. Those are scary. What companies are doing what, who owns what food.
Oh, yeah.
You may not realize where your food comes. We don't know where our food comes from
No, not
for the
anymore.
most part.
Not anymore.
Most people. It's part of why I love my little mango trees in the backyard. I know where they come from.
Exactly. Well, in our produce,
Yeah.
you know.
Yeah, the produce has gotten really because they pick it so early to ship it, because it bruises less when it's young, when it hasn't ripened, and so it doesn't have the tree sugars that it should have. It's an old story.
Mm-hmm.
Tree, when you go out into the orchard and pick the fruit, it's much better.
I remember when we were visiting our daughter and son-in-law up in Spokane, and they took us to an apple orchard up in the mountains above Spokane. Oh my God.
The apples were so good.
Apples there were outrageous.
Mm-hmm.
They were so good. And you come back to Florida,
and you get these mealy.
just not even this. They're
No.
softer, and it's it's
They're just
totally different.
yeah. They don't really have any flavor. Watermelon here doesn't have much flavor. But I was spoiled. I learned about watermelon in California,
Mm-hmm.
where
Oh,
you
yeah.
ate the center out and threw it away when you got to the pits. Not today.
Not today. Nope, not anymore.
Yeah, now they don't even grow pits quite right because they use this. Never mind. We are what we eat, though. We are our food, and that's a whole. We could do a whole show on that. So I'm going to drop that subject and move elsewhere. But technology really shapes our lives, and the tools that we have. We've always had tools. And it's one of the fun things. If you do make it to Williamsburg, I highly recommend that. If you're looking for someplace to go that's different, go and spend a couple of days at Williamsburg. You can get passes just like you do for Disney. You get passes to Colonial Williamsburg, and you get into their shows and their programs. You have to sign up for them and tours and what have you. But they will introduce you to what life was like for the blacksmith, what the midnight oil really means. And you would see the oil lamp with the magnifying glass and how they would project that light so that you could work at needlework and things like that. The different things that people did, because they didn't have games on their phones, because they didn't have phones. They didn't have TV to watch. So what they did to entertain themselves and to relax from their work was very different.
Oh yeah.
But we still
I
have
bet.
those same needs. And so people did traveling entertainers was very important. Bards, musicians coming in through the pubs, very, very important. A big part of what you did, because those were different things. So life is very different today. And as we started out by saying, it's very different since it was even 20 years ago. That's why every 20 years is a generation. Look at how different life was let's say around 2000,
Oh yeah.
as we're coming to 2024 here in a few
Well,
days.
the world was coming to an end, wasn't it?
Yeah, Y2K.
Y2K. I remember that. Oh,
I remember long hours of going through hours and
Oh,
hours of
us,
code.
Us too here.
Yeah.
You know, you think, oh my God, what do we do?
Yeah.
You know, we've got automation systems for 3 stations, and all heck's going to break loose.
Yeah.
And our news director said, "I'll be there. I'll be at the station. If anything happens, I'll call you."
Yeah.
And it was crazy.
Well, the biggest challenge of that, of course, would have been people's birth dates, right? Because somebody who was born in 1950, when it went to 2000, if you just used the 50, wouldn't have been born yet.
That's right. Oh yeah.
Right. And so there were people alive who would have gone from 100 years old to 1 or 2.
Mm-hmm.
And that was the biggest problem. The biggest problem was that we used 2 years to write our dates. And that was one of the big things, if you remember, in 2020, where we told people write all 4 digits, because if you only write the 20, then in 2021, somebody can use that same check and just write 21 at the end of it.
Yeah.
And recycle it.
Just wash a check. Yeah.
Yeah.
Oh yeah, you bet.
So yeah, there were things like that to be aware of. But that was the big issue with Y2K. It wasn't that the year was changing, it was that people had taken a shortcut in software. And programmers are known for hardwiring shortcuts that may not serve, and the year was one of those things, because it would have messed up Social Security for people. It would have messed up who could drive and who couldn't, because you wouldn't have been old enough, and things like that.
Well, and you know, somebody was joking in our bank who does not take Zelle,
Mm-hmm.
and they just said, you know, one mispunch of a computer, goodness knows where that goes. It may not go where you want it to go.
But you know, even before we did things like Zelle, I can remember depositing $3,000 in an account, which is a good amount of money.
Oh, you bet.
In the 1990s, I want to say. And we went to the bank and deposited, I think it was a loan, or it was somebody bought something. I don't remember why we had a big chunk of cash, but we deposited it. And the teller only put in 300.
Oh, no.
Thank goodness I had the receipt from the bank for the deposit, because within a few days, whatever it was that we were going to use that money for bounced checks. And once that bounced, everything else, of course, you had 15 checks that bounce all at the same time. And I remember walking in to a banker I knew and saying, I don't understand why these checks are bouncing. There's $3,000 in there. And he goes and he looks and he says, no, you only deposited 300. And I said, no, we deposited 3,000. And I showed him the receipt. And the receipt said 3,000
on the deposit.
On the deposit slip.
Well, you were safe then.
We were safe, but can you imagine if we hadn't had that piece of paper?
Well, yeah.
Right. So there has always been the potential. In fact, it was easier to slice off a few pennies here and there from a lot of transactions that wouldn't get noticed. Not quite so easy today, because those things are checked more.
Well, you know what some of the gas stations are doing now, and 7-Eleven is notorious for this, where if you punch in whatever it is, Amex or Discover or whatever, and you get $40 worth of gas, they'll punch it out to 75.
Yeah, and then it sits there and you can't touch it.
That's right.
Until it releases.
That's right.
Which takes like 14 days.
Which means they have the use of your money.
Somebody does.
Yeah, somewhere.
Yeah.
Yeah.
That's one of those where the gas company will say it's the credit card company's fault.
Right, correct.
And the credit card company says it's the gas company's fault. And I think it's the bank that benefits from that.
Yeah, it's one of the old they did.
Yeah, they did it. Yeah. And it doesn't take 2 weeks to release that money. It shouldn't.
No.
And it happens more on debit cards than credit cards, but that pending, that locked pending, and you have to be aware of it. Gift cards are famous for that. They'll lock up for a while until they release. So yeah, and people who are living hand to mouth, that's a serious issue, because it'll bounce checks for you.
Oh yeah, you
big
bet.
time, or bounce payments. You'll get NSF.
So 2024 is here.
Yeah. In just
Where are we going to be this time next year when we talk?
That's a good question. That's a good question. Who knows? Right? God willing, there'll be some peace on the planet, but I have no doubts there'll be other hot spots, even if the current 9 hot spots cool off. There'll be others to take their place. But it would be nice if Russia stopped aggressing against Ukraine.
Yeah.
It would be nice if there was peace in the Middle East.
And how do we start rebuilding Gaza?
From the ground up. It's gonna.
I know.
It's gonna.
I just can't even comprehend that.
Well, I'm hearing noises as to, that's going to quote unquote take a consortium, and I hope that consortium exists, that people will put into it what it needs. But it would be really nice if it did get built up into something like, put in a factory for assembling electronic parts or something. Give them some resources to work with. If you've got 2.4 million people, they can do things like that.
And their wages are like pennies a day.
Well, because they're so dirt poor.
Oh.
Gaza was poor before this, and I can't even begin to think of how poor the average Gazan is after this. And how, to me, the real crime is how vicious and wicked Hamas has been to the Gazans. It's a dictatorship. It's an absolute dictatorship. And they feed propaganda. Everybody feeds propaganda.
Everybody spends.
Everybody spends. And I wish that wasn't the case. I wish we could learn to listen and absorb each other's narrative in a way that may not agree with it, but at least acknowledges it. And that we someday get to a more realistic recognition that, all of us, unless you jump off your bed, you can't put your pants on. There's a wonderful cartoon from the Wizard of Id where the king is standing on the bedpost and people are holding the pants up, and he says, "One leg at a time, heck," or "ha," or something like that. It's clear he's going to jump into his pants. But unless you've got a group to help you do that, we are all human. We are all human beings. And what people really, I think, want is food on the table, clothes on their kids' backs and their own backs, and something over their heads so they don't have to dumpster dive.
And education.
Education, basic medical, basic housing, basic food, basic clothing. That's not too much to ask for 100% of the population. It really isn't.
I get it. Yeah.
And that's my prayer for 2024. I hope we get closer to it. I know we're not going to get there, but it would be nice if we got a whole lot closer.
Well, and you've got all these new building materials where, if you did have that consortium all together, we had the Marshall Plan in Europe, for goodness sakes, and something like that.
Look at Germany's been rebuilt. Japan's been rebuilt.
Yeah.
Not that they're without corruption, because people are, unfortunately, unscrupulous people are attracted to money. And the world has an abundance of those, God knows. But we can do things that the way that you eliminate your enemies is not by destruction, but by making them friends and partners. That's how you eliminate enemies, and that's how you make peace. You don't make peace through genocide. You don't make peace by wiping people out. You make peace by making friends and partners and becoming vulnerable and trusting each other. But that's a difficult, challenging process, especially after people have been traumatized. And right, that's the big question with Gaza. Is Israel now breeding a whole new group of potential terrorists
Yeah.
with the orphans and the traumatized population that they've left? I can't begin to think of what it would be like, but I also can't think of what it would be like to live in Sderot or in any of the kibbutzim that went through the October events. It's just, yes, there were times that when I lived in Israel that we went into the shelters, not many, and it was surreal in an interesting way, and I can't imagine what it was like for the people. And the piece that the world is not talking about are the number of rapes and that sort of thing that went on in the Hamas attack. That's not warfare, folks. Rape is not a warfare tactic. That's a bully tactic. That's a gang tactic.
Mhm.
This is gang violence on a horrible scale. It just is. And I don't know a good way to solve that. And I'm forced to watch as other people who think they have the answer struggle to show how difficult it is. So my prayer for 2024 is this very last Ask a Rabbi for 2023, because there is a secular year rolling over, is that we learn from the past and make a better world. Do something kind. Here's a challenge for you folks. Once a month, do something kind that you wouldn't have done otherwise for somebody else, for no good reason other than just to be kind. Let's up the ante. I'm not asking a lot, just once a month, do something nice for somebody that you wouldn't have done if you hadn't thought about this and you hadn't listened to the show. That's my request.
Oh, that's beautiful. Yeah.
And this is Rabbi Shafir Loeb for Congregation Eitz Chayim. We have our Friday night services at 7:30 at 295 Northwest Prima Vista Boulevard at the corner of Irving in the community center of St. Andrew's Lutheran Church. Please join us there.
All right. Have a good week.
You too, and have a great end of the year. Happy New Year.
This is WPSL, Port St. Lucie.